is good to see everyone, and really hard to follow Robert's energy so early in the morning. So everything that Robert had in energy, I'm going to make up with who let that guy on stage and why is he here. So today my topic is really simple. It's a plea on why we should make more stuff. And an alternate title could almost be, where are our unicorns? If you look around, and unicorns is a little loaded, so like where are South Africa's great software companies? And we'll go into a few reasons for why I think we don't see as many of them as we should, and why I think the people in this room should change this. Before we start, a few quick caveats, warnings. Mostly, if anyone knows me, I'm just a bag of quotes or bad movie clips, and mainly it saves too much of original thought. But yeah, I've got a quote for everything. On the bright side, even if my talk completely sucks, you should end up with useful links that you can go and read up on from people who suck less. The other thing that's worth noting is that some of this talk will sting, okay? And part of the reason for that is, yeah, I'm looking around and saying we don't have great software companies and the problem is us. And that stuff always stings a little to hear. And I guess that leads directly to starting with me pointing to someone else. If you've ever seen the folks at 37 Signals, they've been great proponents of building software companies without VC backing. They've got a few really popular books out that are worth reading. And back when their blog was popular, they had this post called "Give It 5 Minutes," and the author was talking about how he went to this conference, somebody was up on stage and somebody said something, and he just took the guy out. Like he went to him straight after the talk and just told the guy why he was wrong. And he says, the speaker looked at him and the speaker said, "Hey man, give it 5 minutes. Like let the thoughts settle." And he has this whole post about how in his take, it was like the speaker had thought about the stuff for a long time and put it down on slides. And he had all this emotional built up and he just had to respond. And it's like, actually, give it 5 minutes. Give it some time, let the idea settle, and see where it goes from there. So, if we are going to ask, why don't we build great software companies, it's probably fair to ask, is that statement true? Like maybe we do. And empirically, if you look at the companies that South Africa creates, if you look at the JSC, if someone's talking about our top tech companies, mostly you'll find they are resellers, they are integrators. You don't see great software companies emerging. And the question is why? And one of the things, we don't have enough time. Clearly, there's enough blame to go around, right? So you can pick on stuff that we're doing wrong at the university level, because somehow Stanford and Harvard managed to churn out Airbnbs and Facebooks and Microsofts consistently, and we don't. And you can look at the stuff that the government should be doing that they aren't doing. But for both of them, I'm going to give them a pass for this talk. Like, I'm not going to talk about the universities, and I'm not going to talk about what government's doing. And when you discuss with people why we don't have big software companies or great software companies, one of the first things people turn to usually is, it's because we don't have the funding environment. It's because we don't have a thriving VC ecosystem. And mostly, I think that's just wrong. For one thing, it's kind of weird that software, which is such a high margin business, has ended up in the world state where we feel we can't build companies unless we first raise millions of dollars. Like it's just a weird situation that was led by Silicon Valley, and today, for some reason, lots of the world believes it. And if you look historically, you'll see lots of the companies that are great companies, even today, didn't raise tons of money, right? Like Microsoft back in the day raised just $1 million for their ridiculous 2.4 trillion market cap. Apple raised $3. Companies like MailChimp raised $0, and MailChimp ended up exiting for like 12 billion. And so it's clearly not true that you need to raise money or you need this VC ecosystem before you can build big, meaningful software companies. And one of the truths here, if you're starting a software company and you're really curious about how you're going to get VC backing, oh, I'm here in South Africa and the great VCs are in Sand Hill Road, like one of the things that's just true is that VCs spend all their time looking for good businesses. You make a good business and they'll find you. Like it's not that hard to get funded. If you make something meaningful, if you make something that users love, you'll find VCs willing to put money into it. Like access to VCs isn't so bad. And one of the questions then is it because our infrastructure in South Africa is so bad? And I worried a lot about this in the early 2000s. Like in the early 2000s, like you'd see Paul Graham and Robert Morris, who started Via Web, and literally in 1996, they were saying, what if we took our software and drove it all via the web browser? And that was way before we could think those thoughts. And if you take Google, also in the 90s, literally the two PhD students started off saying, let's download the internet, and once we've downloaded it, we'll check the backlinks on everything. And if you were in South Africa at that point, like you couldn't contemplate starting off with, let's download the internet before we do the rest of the stuff. And even YouTube in 2005, like they were saying, let's put video on the internet. Everyone will upload this video. And at the time, our infrastructure would give us pretty staggered video. And I was worried that that's where the digital divide would come from, right? That we'd so not be able to live in that world that we wouldn't be able to create products for that world. Like if you can't imagine a world with always on internet, you can't imagine a Spotify. You can't imagine a YouTube if everything you try to load is constantly buffering. But for most of us in this room, at some point the tech equalized, right? Like if you go today, we get our 5G smartphones sometimes ahead of the US. Our broadband beats lots of places in lots of the developed world. So it's not really infrastructure holding us back anymore. And so again, the question is, why don't we start great software companies? If you're a student today, or if you're an engineer like everyone, most of the people in this room, you work on the same laptops, you're building stuff on the same Amazon services, we're reading the same O'Reilly books, connectivity to the same internet. We've even got access to the same courses these days. But somehow, we're still not getting the same results. And one of the things is, I'm going to touch on two of them here, but one of them is that we've become really distracted. Okay, and a little while back, this distraction even shows when you look at this tech equalization. Because we were worried that the tech would be unequal and we wouldn't be able to keep up. We got the equal tech, and instead of building the next YouTube, we ended up spending all our time on the current Instagram. And so you'll find, like in South Africa, we happily compete for who's got the current iPhone or what our broadband is like. but we're not using those to the same effect. And a little while back, there was a comparison done between Huxley's Brave New World and Orwell's 1984. And the whole book is worth reading, and it's been translated into comic form for those of us with short attention spans. And what it shows you, what it goes through, is how Orwell feared that there'd be people who'd ban books, but what Huxley showed was that there'd be nobody who'd want to read them. Orwell feared this world where people would deprive us of info, and Huxley feared a world where we'd just be pushed to passivity and egotism. Orwell feared we'd become a captive culture, and Huxley feared we'd become a trivial culture. Okay, and essentially, Orwell feared that what we hate would ruin us, and Huxley feared that what we love would ruin us. And there's this really strong quote in it that says, in The New World Revisited, the people who are on the lookout to oppose tyranny fail to take into account our almost infinite appetite for distraction. Okay, and mostly what I'm saying is that these days, it's much easier to be distracted. And you see it all the time. And we don't have tech as the excuse, and we don't have funding as the excuse, but somehow we're just too busy to actually make stuff. And although the term gets abused a lot, in a way, for a while, the States has treated the internet as one of its colonies, okay? And we've become colonized to the point where we don't think we're the same as our American counterparts or as our Silicon Valley counterparts. Ben Horowitz, his last book was called What You Do Is Who You Are. And the whole book is about building culture at startups, building culture at companies. And interestingly, he has this long section on a Haitian general called Toussaint Louverture. And part of the reason he focuses so much on Toussaint is because he says something that I didn't know previously, which is that slave revolutions never succeed. And Toussaint is one of the people who led a successful slave revolution. And one of the reasons that slave revolutions don't succeed is because when you enslave people, you don't just shackle them physically, you change the way they think. You rob them of hope, and you rob them of some of the things they need to then run their new things, their new countries. And you see when it comes to software, in South Africa, you often see that even though all of us, to a man, to a woman, think we're as good as anyone else in the world, we just don't think we can do the stuff. And we don't think that the people who look like us can do the stuff. And intellectually, we might disagree with this, but if I show you a router that was made in Stellenbosch and a router that comes out of Palo Alto or Cisco, like hands down, South African companies choose the one over the other. There's just an expectation of quality from one over the other. And a little while back, there was this really interesting thread on Twitter where a former Tesla employee went onto Twitter and started talking about how much of Tesla's infrastructure was cobbled together and running with spit and sellotape. Okay, and so he went on, he said, look, my NDAs are up. I'm going to tell you about some of Tesla's insides. And of course, it was a complete horror show, right? He's talking about how you can open VPN into cars, how Model S's can be rebooted with bash scripts, how cars had to be called in because certificates expired. It's all the sort of things that you see in your environment that you will not expect from Tesla. And he went on, and people commented, and people clutched their pearls because how horrific is this? And at some point, someone from the security industry, a really famous hacker who's done work for national security agencies, done work actually for Twitter, done work for lots of companies, he went on Twitter and he said, "Dear world, this is how stuff works in the connected world." And what he was saying was not to make an excuse for Tesla, because at some point you've got to pay down your technical debt, and if people are rolling around in software that you write, you probably want to be a little more cautious. But Mudge's point here was that, listen, that's what software looks like. Like, that's what companies look like. It's not that surprising. And Chris Anderson, who used to be the editor of Wired, he had this article a little while back where he said that the problem with tech media is not that they don't understand tech, it's that they don't understand business. And again, you'll see the same theme where he says, like, businesses, lots of these companies suck, and it's not because they're corrupt or because they're malevolent or because they're mismanaged. It's because the stuff is messy. And that's just what it is. And what you'll find is that all of us end up much more forgiving when the company is shiny and VC-backed and living in the States, and a lot less forgiving when that stuff happens to be closer to home. And so in a way, one of the big things we need to get right is to start accepting that all software sucks. And you iterate till it sucks a little less, and someday it actually becomes good. But if we never trust local software the same way, we kind of strangle it in its crib, and it never gets this opportunity to grow up and be better. Like, I can tell you from our personal experience, like, we're a software company and we build a product, and we didn't try to sell it all in South Africa when we started. Like, our first, even today, by far, our customers overseas are way larger in number than South African companies. And part of the reason is because if we sell locally, mostly we get advice. Mostly we have people telling us how we should do this, how we should consider do that. And literally, like we've had periods where we laughed because literally we'd have like great customers, Slack, Airbnb, Uber, telling us like, hey, this rocks. And from a local company, we'd get, we'd consider that if only you did these other things. It's a problem, and it's hurting us, and it's something that we've all got to fix. And if we're going to do this, if we're going to, especially for the people in this room, if we're going to build software, one of the things we have to start doing is being more honest with ourselves. In the run-up to this talk, one of the interviews that I had, the interviewer asked me like a typical interview question, which is like super optimistic, which is like, what do South Africans have that's special, that'll allow us to be great on the world stage? And my honest answer is, I don't know. Like I don't know that that's necessarily a thing. Like in a fairy tale world, I'd say, yes, like we built up resilience during apartheid, or we have this, or we're super optimistic. But I don't know. Like I don't know that there's anything special. What I do know is that the world's gotten smaller, and we compete with the whole world for lots of stuff. And if we're not careful, we will end up being another call center country for the world. We will end up being the people who just do the run-of-the-mill software and not the software that actually is innovative and creative and builds industries. And it's less about how we special and can therefore do different, and how we kind of need to get our tails into gear and get into action before it's too late and we can't. And if there's one thing that you should take away from this talk, like if everything else is terrible, there's this really great paper. I think I've referred to it in almost all the hand-wavy keynotes that I've done. There's this paper called You and Your Research by a mathematician called Richard Hamming. And if you haven't read it, you should. It's life-changingly good. And in it, Richard Hamming is addressing a bunch of students at Bell Labs, and he gives them advice on how to do great work. And you can reread this multiple times a year. For some things, it'll kick you in the tail and remind you how you're not really trying as hard as you should. And at other times, it'll inspire you. And when you look at just how the paper starts, right, Hamming talks about, how did I come to do this study? Because he says what he's going to look at in this paper, or in his talk, is the difference between people who do great work and people who don't. And he says, how did I do it? And he starts off by saying, look, he was brought onto the Manhattan Project, and he was there to get the computers working. And he was working with Fermi and Beth and Feynman and Oppenheimer. And he says, I looked around, and I saw that I was just a stooge. Like, I was there fixing computers, and here were these great scientists who were going to change the world. And of course, what's interesting is, like, if you've heard of him or if you followed his career, Hamming goes on to have an illustrious career, right? Like, we do Hamming equations today. We do Hamming differentiation. But at that point in his career, he starts off by doing honest reflection and going, listen, like, I'm not those guys. I need to up my game. And then he starts looking at, well, what does it take for me to up my game? And South Africa is interesting because, like I say, when we sell, one of the things we consistently get in South Africa is advice. And you'll find a surprisingly rare trait when you speak to lots of South African tech people, where almost all of us believe that we can run Apple. Like we can run Facebook. On any given day, ask us what Zuckerberg should be doing, and we'll sit down and talk to you about all the things he's doing wrong. Okay, and interestingly, at the same time, if you give us a project to run with 4 people under us, we'll tell you why it's difficult because this person has a problem and those people have a problem, and real-world constraint number 2. And we look at Facebooks and Apples and all of the stuff, and sometimes we kind of think it's an accident that they got to where they were. And if you take a Zuckerberg, who much has been written off and is really easy to hate for lots of reasons, if you track his record, you'll see that already in high school, he had built a multi-user chat program and put it out. During high school, he built and released this Synapse music player that was using machine learning to build your playlists that was up on Slashdot. You know, if you watch the Facebook movie, that he gets to school and he builds course mesh, and then he builds face mesh, and then he builds Facebook. Okay, and what you see is a long track record of building things and putting things out. And the question is, why don't we? Like building things and putting things out is almost table stakes before we can make greater stuff, before we can make things. And for the most part, we just don't, or don't do it enough. if you want to follow someone on Twitter, besides for following all of the Musk drama that it seems to dominate these days, there's a product manager called Shreyas. And Shreyas worked at Stripe, worked at Google, worked at Yahoo. And these days, he spends all his time giving advice to product managers and developers on how to further their career. And fairly recently, he had this interview where he was talking to people in India. He went to India and he was talking to a whole bunch of people who went to the same university as him. And he looked around and he asked this question and he said, "What are you world class at?" And it's an interesting question when you stop and think about it properly. Like someone asking you, not what are you good at, what do you think you world class at? And he had this long thing about how, firstly, lots of people don't even try to be world class at stuff. Like they pick their level, they're happy that they're better than Bob who's working in the office next door, and they're not trying to do any better. And again, considering the world is so much smaller these days, there's almost no reason for us not to. Like we shouldn't be pegging ourselves just at the people who happen to be born in the town next to us. We should be comparing ourselves against the best in the world. Like if we're writing stuff, why aren't we up there? Like why can't we write a better algorithm than Netflix for choosing the next movie? They put that stuff up. There's a little bit of whether we end up aiming too low. And Hamming actually starts his paper with this because he says, look, to get into your head, you're going to have to start just by admitting, yes, I want to do great stuff. He says that these days, the world kind of nudges you to be embarrassed to say that. So people don't happily stand up and say, yes, I want to do great things. And Hamming ends up defining it by saying, he's talking about research, and he says, he's talking about Fields Medal research or Nobel Prize research. But he says, the starting point is saying, yep, that's what I want to do. And then let's try to find out how we can do it. And interestingly, you'll find that you can start your career in tech and start solving a problem for some company, and you blink and you're now middle-aged with mortgages and a pool, and you don't even think about this anymore. The thought that says, actually, I want to be world-class at something. I want to do something that's significant. It kind of disappears before we've had the chance to do it. And the question always comes up then that says, what you're doing what you're talking about sounds hard. What about work-life balance? And both those people actually address it because Shreyas, when he's talking during that interview, and I'll post the link after the talk, he says to people, look, he hears a lot about work-life balance, but he hasn't seen anyone do something great without being slightly off-balanced. And way back in Hamming's essay, Hamming has this great section where he talks about how knowledge compounds just like interest. And he ends up talking, he gives various examples of how giving a little more every day ends up compounding and gives you such oversized results. And at some point he says, look, he's had to be a little unfair to dedicate himself to his career. That's what is demanded of it. In the Q&A to that talk, someone asks him again about it, and he's a little more descriptive, and he says, look, you can go home and have a nice life and have a balanced life, or you can do this great, significant work. And at some point, you've got to choose and figure it out. And because of this audience, I want to say this doesn't mean tolerating working for an employer who makes all his bad planning your problem and makes you work till midnight every day. Because that's not the same thing, right? Like a company that overworks you is not the same as working really hard for your craft and becoming really good at what you do, or trying to be better, or trying to do significant work. And one of the questions that always come up then is like we technical, we have skills, we can build stuff, but we don't have the big idea. Like we're waiting for that big idea so that we can build the thing. And in Hemming's paper, he talks about, in this case slightly differently, he talks about how many scientists are ruined after they do something great, because once they do, they can no longer work on small things. And working on small things is what leads to great things. And for all of us, it's the same thing happens because we want the big idea and we want the grand thing. And if we had an idea like Facebook, we'd also sink our time into it and build that company. But before you can build a Facebook, you've got to build the Synapse, and you've got to build the Talk project, and you've got to build the course mesh. You've got to build and put out the tiny, insignificant things that allow you to grow your following, get people working with you, allow you to build some of those muscles. And the simple thing there is that we just need to build more stuff. We just need to release more stuff. And like fundamentally, one of the things we've got to avoid like the plague is this thing where we just end up consuming. Almost all of us, well, it's a safe bet that everyone here has read a blog post, read a useful tech blog post in the last month. And the question is, why don't we write more blog posts? Like writing is something so simple, right? But what you find ends up happening is you put out the small blog post, and inevitably at some point you'll start getting replies and you'll start getting an audience. And even if you don't, there's intrinsic value in creating and putting stuff out instead of just consuming. But it's a muscle that we need to build. And it's going to be hard. It's harder to produce stuff instead of just consume stuff. And one of the things that stop lots of people is that your early stuff sucks, right? And that's just the truth. And Ira Glass had this super great, I hope it actually plays well. He had this great quote.
Nobody tells people who are beginners, and I really wish somebody had told this to me, is that all of us who do creative work, like, we get into it, and we get into it because we have good taste. But it's like there's a gap, that for the first couple of years that you're making stuff, what you're making isn't so good, okay? It's not that great. It's trying to be good. It has ambition to be good, but it's not quite that good. But your taste, the thing that got you into the game, your taste is still killer. And your taste is good enough that you can tell that what you're making is kind of a disappointment to you. You know what I mean? A lot of people never get past that phase. A lot of people at that point, they quit. And the thing I would just like say to you with all my heart is that most everybody I know who does interesting creative work, they went through a phase of years where they had really good taste, they could tell what they were making wasn't as good as they wanted it to be. They knew it felt short. It didn't have this special thing that we wanted it to have. And the thing I would say to you is everybody goes through that. And for you to go through it, if you're going through it right now, if you're just getting out of that phase, you got to know it's totally normal. And the most important possible thing you could do is do a lot of work. Do a huge volume of work. Put yourself on a deadline so that every week or every month you know you're going to finish one story. Because it's only by actually going through a volume of work that you're actually going to catch up and close that gap. And the work you're making will be as good as your ambitions. In my case, like I took longer to figure out how to do this than anybody I've ever met. it takes a while. It's going to take you a while. It's normal to take a while, and you just have to fight your way through that. Okay?
And I guess it leads to the next thing, which is that you want to be kind to people who are actually making stuff. Okay? Because like making stuff is putting yourself out there, and no talk is complete without quoting Anton Ego. And it's particularly pertinent, again, to us as South Africans, because we've somehow magically managed to get both these things perfect, where we don't create that much anymore, but we're super good at criticizing people who do, especially if they're local. And if you watch the Anton Ego speech, he talks about how the new needs friends. Okay, more than anything else, the new needs friends. And I must say, a few years back, I read this book. I'm not sure if anyone else had, called The Right Kind of Crazy. It's an amazing book. So Adam Stelzner, who writes the book, was on the project that got the lander on Mars. And the book ends up being a description of technical product management in the face of ridiculous, impossible odds, right? He goes through all the stuff, like how they invented the magic sky crane that ends up dropping the rover. And throughout the book, you just see time after time, like they come up with an idea, the idea meets the laws of physics, it breaks. They try something, JPL says why it can't be done. They end up inventing entirely new physics to make this thing land. The book's really amazing. If you get a chance to read it, you should. The audiobook is also crazy. But more than anything, reading the book makes you really sad. And it makes you sad because you realize that, like, if we are born in South Africa, that's not for us. Like if you're doing physics, you can get to the top of your game and be really excellent, and sorry, you don't get to land a craft on Mars, because we don't have a JPL. And it doesn't matter how good you're going to be, you're not going to do that unless you leave the country. And you see all these people working at NASA, working at JPL, working at SpaceX, doing really amazing stuff. And by definition, we can't, because we weren't born there, and we're not going to get a chance to do that stuff. But software is different. Like, software gives us the opportunity because we just don't have a constraint holding us back. And right now might be the absolute best time ever to be a indie software developer or a small company building software. Like for us, we are a tiny company sitting in South Africa, and literally we've got customers on all 7 continents. Like, one of the joys of my life is a photo of our product next to penguins in Antarctica. And we can do it now because the world is different, and the internet makes distribution easy. And software also means that you get to be an upstart more easily. Like, how many of you are playing with Rust? Like, there's not a lot of people in the world with a lot more Rust experience than you have. In June, Apple's going to release, we suspect, their new VR goggles. And when they do, there's not going to be a lot of developers with more Apple VR experience than you'll have. Like, the whole world will start off with 1 month's experience and go. And there's no reason why you can't be the best in the world in that technology, because everyone's learning it almost from a flat start. The world is just so much smaller. Like, in the old days, you'd be born in somewhere and you're restricted to the people who live in your town, right? Like the old thing was that you're the average of the 5 people you interact with most. But the internet lets you choose your tribe, right? Like you can take a class on machine learning from the same Stanford professor who teaches it to everyone else. And you can join a Slack or Discord channel where literally the people inventing the future of machine learning and GANs is talking to you. You just have to step up and contribute to that thing. And if you're building a software company, the days are gone where you can build it, but you can't sell it unless you have a team full of people in suits to go and press the flesh and take people to steak dinners. Like, our company does literally 0 outbound sales. Like, we've got no salespeople in the traditional sense. And we've managed to scale to millions of dollars of revenue. And that's not because we've done anything special. Companies like Slack and GitHub have changed operating models, right? They've shown the world that you can make software that companies can pull up, where engineers will pay with their credit card and pull you into the business. And at some point, they'll buy an enterprise version of you because they've got 50 copies of you running around the business. There's different models now, and building companies just isn't what it used to be. Mainly, we just need to step up and throw our hat in the ring. We need to see that it's possible. We need to see that it's needed. And then we just need to do it. I'll end with this quote. For those of you who used to or learned Ruby, there was a very famous programmer called Y the Lucky Stiff. And he had this quote that was so great that said, when you don't create things, you become defined by your tastes rather than your ability. And when you look around at our tech world, you see this in spades. You see someone being a Mac person or a Windows person or an iPhone person or an Android person. It's like we're picking soccer teams, right? That stuff doesn't make any difference. And in part, it's because that stuff allows us to choose a tribe. And instead, what you want to do is create. I think we've got 2 minutes for questions, but also I'm Haroon Meer on Twitter. You can tell me why I'm an idiot there, or we've got 2 minutes. I'll happily take any questions. Thanks for your time.
I feel like in my work, I often feel a tension between using existing frameworks such as React versus exploring and creating, such as creating a new framework that's probably not as good as React. How would you deal with that in your company if you had an employee who wanted to recreate a framework that wasn't React, but kind of emulated it?
It's a super good question. So the question between like existing frameworks exist and someone wants to create a new one, how would we deal at it? How would we deal with it at the company? So specifically with our company, we have a thing where we default to wanting to invent stuff, and I'll give you the caveat. And so if there's an opportunity to invent stuff, we want to invest in it and take the steps towards it. But we're also careful then to not try to reinvent everything, because building another version of another framework stops you from inventing something meaningful. And so we try hard, like the company's kind of organized so that we try hard to spot a chance to go, okay, for this one, here's the best thing. For this one, here's the best thing. For this one, oh, look, that's an unsolved problem. Like, we should aim for this thing because here's a chance to invent stuff. And so I don't think there's an easy answer, but we specifically constantly on the lookout for, is there a chance to invent something here? Because if there is, it gives us a chance to stretch our legs. It gives us a chance to maybe do something cool. Over time, it gives us a chance to hire the sorts of people who are our people, because if that's the sort of thing that you like, then that's the sort of thing that we do. So we think there's this whole positive loop that happens if you keep that in mind and if that's how you're aiming. Thanks for the question. Anyone else?
So you spoke a bit about giving government and universities a bit of a get out of jail free, and I agree with it for the purpose of this. But do you feel similarly about the general buying market within South Africa? So Philip Hubert posted, the founder of Office, posted an article about the startup market, and he recommended famously not to do B2C companies. And you mentioned South African companies trying to give you advice instead of buy. Do you feel that happening generally?
Yeah, so I do think South Africa is a bad market for locally made tech. And I'd like that to change, but I don't see how you'd change that yet. And I think there's like the very abused, like be so good they can't ignore you. And mainly I'm hopeful because you can survive without them for now. Like the world is like, if you put your stuff up, you can get customers that are not local companies. And local companies will buy. We end up selling to local companies now who don't know that we're local. And they end up buying us anyway. I think government has a role to play that's not often discussed, but there's this whole really interesting paper on how the history of Silicon Valley was actually built on government military contracts. And it's not a secret. It's the government needed stuff for the war. The universities stepped up and said, we can build stuff for the war effort. And Silicon Valley was actually like Radar Valley at some point. And even today, you see huge, significant companies like Oracle were built and designed to meet the needs of the intelligence agencies. There's this very possible, comfortable symbiosis between governments that need software and companies that can build that software and then initially get a guaranteed customer. And then that software can grow up and serve the general public, which you don't see happening in South Africa. Largely for the same reason. Like anytime there's a big South African software project, almost by default, you'll see people from Microsoft or people from Google roll in. If government has a thing on entrepreneurship, they bring in people from Uber and Google and Microsoft. And those companies weren't entrepreneurial for the last 15 years. Like, so you see a missing link there where I think we are poorer for it. But again, for the people in this room, like when you're building a company, there's just a series of hacks, right? Like this is possible, so you do it. This is not possible, so you root around it. And in our situation, government's not particularly helpful right now, and your first customers are probably not going to be South African companies. That's the field you've got. Like, go win anyway. And the good thing is that today we can. I think that's the last question. Thanks so much for your time. Like I say, you can tweet me and tell me why I'm wrong or catch me in the hall. Thanks so much.